Hi, Ted Morrissey here making a video for my Lindenwood University course in the MFA program. And specifically, this video is inspired by your lineage exercise, where you were asked to sort of trace the literary lineage of your interests in writing. In other words, what books and authors inspired you when you were younger, and then who did that kind of lead to your reading, and so on and so forth. And so I thought I'd do a video where I maybe kind of do a similar thing, not exactly the same, but again, this is inspired by that particular assignment. And earlier this year, I published this book, Delta of Cassiopeia. It's collected stories and sonnets, and this video is not an advertisement for that, but just I bring it up because it's related to what we're talking about here. Because in the introduction, I go into quite a bit of detail. Actually, I talk about a lot of things, but I also go into quite a bit of detail about sort of my evolution as a writer. And so that's what this video is going to be about. But if you're interested to read more, you could eventually take a look at that. All right. So, I was born in 1962. I'm kind of the very end of the baby boomers. And as a consequence, I was kind of raised reading this guy, Ernest Hemingway. My high school teachers were Hemingway devotees. So in high school, I read a bunch of stories, and I remember having to read several novels for various English classes when I was in high school. And then, of course, I went on and did my undergrad work at SIU Carbondale, Southern Illinois University Carbondale, and again, a bunch of my professors were Hemingway, inspired in themselves, so they taught a lot of Hemingway. So I got a lot of Hemingway, all right. And so when I first started writing short stories, I was very much of the mindset that I needed to emulate Hemingway. So the short. Very staccato kind of sentences, very much drawing from my own experiences, because that's another sort of rule for creative writers, especially when they're starting off, to write what you know. Right. So I spent years writing what I knew, which wasn't very much, quite honestly, because I did not have as nearly of a colorful life as Hemingway did. So I was drawing from my experiences, but, they weren't terribly exciting, quite honestly. I managed to get a few of those stories published because they were technically okay. But again, not terribly exciting in terms of the plots and so forth, right? But Hemingway was definitely the first writer that I tried to emulate and kind of model my own writing after, right? Then eventually, I started working on my master's in English, and again went back to SIU Carbondale. I was a little older now. I was, around 30 or so, doing it as a part-time student, and at that time, SIU Carbondale didn't have an MFA program, but they were moving in that direction. So my MA was very much like an MFA, and so I had to take courses in workshop courses and those kinds of things. Well, I made a mistake one semester, but it turned out to be a really good mistake, because I signed up for a class with this guy who only taught for a semester at SIU Carbondale, Juan Felipe Herrera, but it ended up being one of the most important courses and encounters of my writing life. Now, Juan Felipe, this was back in the 90s, Juan Felipe eventually became, as you may know, United States Poet Laureate. So that's kind of cool. So one of my former teachers eventually became a Poet Laureate. He ended up coming to a town as Poet Laureate to a program, and I had a chance to talk with him, and he very graciously pretended to remember me, which I'm sure is not true, but he's just a nice guy, and so he pretended to remember me. But anyway, my encounter with Juan Felipe as a writer was really, really important. Now, it was a mistake because I was a fiction guy, and Juan Felipe was teaching a poetry seminar. I don't know how I got confused and took that class instead of the fiction seminar I was supposed to take. But once I got in there, even though I realized it was a mistake, Juan Felipe was so good, such a great teacher, and just a really interesting person that I stuck it out. And it ended up being, again, one of the most important encounters of my life as a writer, because what Juan Felipe did for me was to get me out of that Hemingway mode of writing what you know and to use my imagination. So in his class, even though it was focused on poetry, Juan Felipe didn't care really what you wrote as long as you were inspired to write it. And so for one of the assignments, I wrote a little short story, very short story. Now keep in mind that during my writing workshops, my short stories were getting torn to shreds. Oh my gosh, it was merciless. The criticism that my fellow students would lay on me in workshop. And so when I was used to sharing my work and just expecting it to be just, like I said, torn asunder, well, I submitted this little short story to Juan Felipe. And again, this was a very imaginative piece. It was not based on my own life experiences at all. And Juan Felipe returned it a few days later, and the only comment on it was written at the top, "Ready for publication." No criticism whatsoever, no suggestions for changes, just ready for publication. And I had never, ever gotten that from an instructor. And so I sent it out. I found a little magazine that I thought might be an appropriate place to send it. I just sent it to that one place. Again, I was used by this point to getting just about everything, well, not just about, but literally everything rejected. And I waited a few months, and lo and behold, that story was published, and it became my first publication. So that was important in itself. But the main thing that I got from Juan Felipe and that I drew from that course and that experience was not to rely just on my own experiences, but to write via my imagination. Don't be contained within my own little world, but rather just write about whatever I wanted to write. And so from that on, I started writing very imaginative kinds of things. I wrote a sequel to Homer's Odyssey. I wrote a couple of novels inspired by Mary Shelley and her novel Frankenstein, and so on. So Juan Felipe helped to unlock my imagination and just really expanded my world in terms of what to write about. Well, then I had another fortunate encounter when I was working on my doctorate. And unfortunately, I never had this person as an actual instructor. But while getting ready to write my dissertation after several years of coursework and doctoral seminars and all kinds of stuff, I ran into this guy's work, William H. Gass. And specifically, I read his short story, novella, different people call it different things, In the Heart of the Country. It was in an anthology, the Norton Anthology of Postmodern Literature, or maybe American Postmodern Literature, something like that. And I distinctly remember that day because I had gotten that book, and I really wasn't planning on doing any particular in-depth reading at the moment. I was just kind of flipping through the book, and one of the stories in there was a used book, very used, as a matter of fact. Had just all kinds of yellow highlighter and marginal notes from a previous owner. And it was this story with a strange title, In the Heart of the Country, and by this guy named William H. Gass, who embarrassingly I had never heard of up to that point. Actually, I kind of remembered afterward. I sort of knew who he was, but at the moment I didn't think I really knew who he was. And I started reading, and I couldn't put it down. Like I said, it's a long story, almost novella length, and I sat there just mesmerized and read that entire story. And then, as luck would have it, just a week or two later, I went to the AWP conference. That's the big writing publishing conference that happens every year. Just happened to be in Chicago that year, so which is near where I live. So I went to the AWP conference in Chicago, and there was a tribute to William H. Gass as in one of the programs. And so they had so people come on and say some nice things about Gass, but then there he was, reading from his work. He was already quite old by this point, but still very, very vibrant and read from his work. And I was just really hooked at that point, and there's been no turning back. And here's what Gass taught me. The main thing was to focus on language that, Plots, characterization, we've been telling each other stories for millions of years. There really aren't that many different stories to tell. Other people have identified maybe 9 plots, 9 different stories that we just keep telling each other again and again and again. So don't focus on plot and characterization. Focus on the language. Focus on the structure of the language. Try to make that as interesting, as beautiful, if possible, as you can. And so that really changed my whole approach to writing when I discovered gas. And so since then, and again, this has been now 10, 12 years, I have mainly been interested in language and the structure of language. Now, I'm much more sort of traditional in my thinking about narrative than Gass was. If you read Gass's novels and short stories, they're very non-traditional. There's not a lot of plot going on. Characterization is very unusual, because what Gass was interested in was the language, the beauty of the language. And so I'm more traditional. I tend to think in terms of plot and characterization, but now I also think in terms of the beauty of the language. So start off as a kind of Hemingway guy, then Juan Felipe in the 90s changed my thinking and encouraged me to use my imagination and not just my lived experience to write about. And then eventually I encountered Gass's work, and that sort of opened up my eyes to focusing on the language and not so much on plot, characterization, setting, and those kinds of things. Now, I had a bunch of other great teachers along the way. Those were the ones I really think of in terms of milestones. But, going back to my undergrad days, my first creative writing instructor was a guy named Philip Graham, who was a great writer and a great instructor and a great person. And he was really inspirational to me. My thesis committee that I worked with on my master's, besides Kent Haruf, who I've mentioned in other contexts, in other videos and so forth. I also worked with Ricardo Cortez Cruz, who was a wonderful writer, and a woman named Beth Lordan, who also was a great writer and who gave me a lot to think about in terms of fiction versus nonfiction and that kind of thing, and so on. So I've been very fortunate to have a lot of great teachers, especially in terms of creative writing teachers. But those are kind of the main ones that I can look back on and say they definitely changed my views of writing and what to write about and how to write about it. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and I'll see you down the digital trail.